this meeting. This is about how we should deal with our growing database. Our database is growing and it's not sustainable, as in it's getting into, it's approaching 10 terabytes, I think. We should either shard it or extract services. And the proposal of the team is to extract services, and it's a big decision, so I wanted to make sure I was fully informed. I left a bunch of suggestions on the document. Not all of them are added, so maybe Craig, you want to go through that?
Which doc are we referring to? The brainstorming session doc?
Yeah, so for example, my assumption is that service extraction will give us about 5x headroom, assuming our largest service is 20% of the total.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's still, so this was kind of a late breaking discussion to move down the service extraction route. There's still some research that would need to be done to figure out what the impact of that headroom is. We have some new services coming in, like Prefect and Container Registry are the ones that are most frequently talked about as far as potential for new services being extracted. And then from existing functionality, we've talked about taking a look at CI/CD daemon. The pull mirror scheduling is another one that we've talked about. And I think there's a third that's slipping my mind right now. But bottom line is we're not sure what the overall impact is on extracting those. So we would need to do some more research on that.
Would that change this statement, or would that just be because you're going to another statement like, hey, does it get easier or harder to do the next step? And I think it gets harder. You're not sure. Mm-hmm. We don't have to have that conversation. You're still working on it. However, I think whatever you think, it's still only buying you that headroom. This is two. I added two. This is one suggestion with two things. Sorry, I thought I made my suggestions row by row.
I'm sorry.
I've also added some disadvantages of moving to many services. Did anybody have a chance to look at that in the 2 days since I made it?
There's the one question that came up on testing becomes harder with multiple services. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Because the way I'm thinking of it is with the services a little more isolated, it actually could make testing easier.
Yes, small tests get easier. Like for example, if you now test the main Rails app, it takes a while to just load the test. I think this is more in reference to if you want to do an integrated test. Now, not only do you have to set up the application under test, you have to set up all the other services as well in order to do kind of an end-to-end test. So maybe I should testing complex testing end-to-end. Is that a good way to phrase it?
Yeah, agree. I mean, sorry, I struggle with brainstorming because you're not supposed to shoot down ideas, but I would think that would also help us to test our setup to make sure that it's seamless for customers, right? So I see it still. I see some advantages to it. You're right. I mean, there's more configuration settings. There's more surface area that you need to configure and set up and test. So I see pros and cons on both sides. I think on the next one, the observability and debugging becomes harder.
Can I just pick up on the testing thing before we move on from it?
Yeah.
So this is the route. It's a different technology, but it's the same approach that we've used with Redis, right? We have 4 different Redis servers, and as far as customers and self-managed are concerned, it's one sort of, we use the same actual physical instance, but on GitLab.com, we divide it up into 4 physical servers, and it doesn't have any impact on our testing. It doesn't have any impact on the way we've been able to scale self-managed, it hasn't had a big impact there either. So I think if we took that same approach here, we would have this, we could do it in the same way where it's not a big impact on testing, I don't think.
I think that would alleviate a lot of the concerns and the questions I have. That's not how I read the service extraction proposal. But if that's the case, that for self-managed it would still work in the same way.
That's right.
Is everyone? Is that the understanding of everyone?
That's definitely my understanding, is that we have to have it behave the same way. If we have like dual code paths as an example, that's going to be really problematic. I'm really against any kind of dual code path solution. The intent would be is that a hosted customer would have the same experience, albeit maybe it's slightly overhead because we'd obviously have processes within the same host from that solution. But essentially, the scale out would be just basically breaking that out based on the need for either higher power in a particular part of the services or different pieces of it.
Okay, so I'm a bit like maybe let's get down to the first example, the first example of the service extraction, the container registry. As I understood the proposal, it was to make a new database for the service registry that the Rails app wouldn't directly talk to. So from the Rails app, it would be hard to see what containers you have and what the versions are and things like that. What Andrew is saying now is like, no, it would work like Redis would work. So can someone maybe talk me through how that works on a technical level?
So obviously we're talking about logical databases on a self-managed instance. We're primarily talking about logical databases on the same physical database server. So the only difference is that it's like a namespace on the server. So we're saying this is the CI namespace, and this is the Rails namespace, or the monolith. We don't want to call it that, but something along those lines. And so over time, we'll extract these services, and each one will have a logical database name. On GitLab.com, we then have the option to take that and spin it off onto a different server, right? And that's the first step. And then the second step is we can partition that server, then we can shard that server. And that's what we've done with Redis. We've got 3 Redis instances at the moment. Self-managed all do the same on one. We've got 3, and one of them we're going to take out and break it out into Redis cluster soon, hopefully. It's all behind the abstraction of Redis, right? And this is the same. It's all behind a single Postgres abstraction.
If I have a self-managed instance today, I just set up a single Redis service with a single kind of, well, there's no authentication in Redis, so don't have to do that. If you have multiple databases, my Rails app would suddenly need multiple kind of accounts. And if I set up Geo, I have to start streaming multiple databases. So I don't see how you could kind of do it the same way you do Redis.
With Geo, we are using, what's the name of the replication?
Streaming replication. Streaming replication.
Someone else can probably speak to this better than I can, but yeah, it's, as far as I understand, it's not a big deal, right?
Yeah, with Geo, you basically get every database that is on that instance of the database, right? So you create another database, you get that for free.
Yeah, let's call it the database manager. So that, or database instance, I mean, database manager. Whatever.
And it's even more, Postgres is even more interesting. I have 2 ways of doing that, right? You have a different, whatever you're going to, logical database within the instance, but there's also this idea of a schema so you can have a single database with different schemas too. That's another way we might tackle this problem, where container registry might have its own schema in the GitLab HQ production database, but like the only people who can actually physically see it is the container registry. Or if we wanted to have the Rails app see it, we could do that too, but it doesn't limit us, I guess.
So suppose, does the Rails app get access to the container registry?
It could.
Data or not?
It doesn't have to, though. Like, we could restrict it. I don't know if that's an open question whether we want it to actually be able to dig into the layers and things like that. And if we do, then if it's on the same schema, you can do that. But if we want to restrict that, then you can also change the access permissions of the user.
Doesn't it, like right now we have packages in GitLab. We have tons of different packages for Python, for other stuff. Containers, I see that as another type of package. So packages are in like GitLab HQ, the main database, now containers are handled differently.
Hey,
I
so
thought, go ahead.
sorry to jump in there. Yeah, I think from a user perspective, we could look at it as being sort of similar in the way that users look at these things. It doesn't really account for a lot of the ways that container registry is interacted with by users. But the data we're actually talking about creating a separate schema for is the manifest. It's a low level breakdown of what's actually in images. It's actually not the user storage. Currently we get, sorry, not the user related tables of what they see in terms of the UX. What we're doing to get that right now is we're actually hitting the container registry's API and returning data. One of the reasons why the performance of that is not the best real time right now for our users and something we're trying to solve. So the data that we would expect to end up as user facing and does relate more closely to our monorepo, I would expect that to end up in the same schema that we have right now. But the communication is via an API, and that might continue, although it doesn't have to if we have a separate schema within the same database. So it's two different types of data. It's purely the manifest we're talking about with a separate database right now, or separate schema within the same database. Does that answer your question?
Okay. That would answer my question, and that would address a lot of my concerns. That's absolutely not how I read the proposal. It doesn't say anywhere like, oh, the list of containers would still live in GitLab HQ, but the manifest would live in a separate thing.
Well, it could. Now, and the proposal might say we want to keep these all separate right now, but what I'm really concerned about is that at the core level, we're trying to implement online garbage collection for our container registry. That hasn't been done anywhere. And so we're trying to find the optimal solution for that. And so I'm really worried about the idea that this internal file, the structure that we're creating to represent this internal system, as well as the other system we're trying to support, OCI and Helm, it would be negatively impacted if we choose to sort of put it on the Rails side and how we actually implement that, because it's a core level system. It's a core level representation of data for the container registry that's intended to reflect only that. Again, we can put it in there and keep the user facing stuff in a separate schema, or we could put it in Rails. We could share access at some point. It's really about ownership of the schema that I'm really worried about here.
Yeah, that makes total sense. But that's not what kind of this document, this brainstorming document is leading the user to believe, like, oh yeah, now the container registry, it's complex, and we'll have the list in one database and the manifest in another. And this is how we're going to join those two, because I assume you have to do joins. Like you have to see, oh, well, for this container that's in my list, what's in the manifest and things like that. So
I think like maybe the confusion is like that logical database represents like the functional part. Container registry, like it's fully functional part. You cannot really split tags from the manifest, because it's like we are kind of gonna be putting what is currently on the object storage into some of the data into database. But it still allows us, because it's like it's in the same logical database, to efficiently query the data. It's like the question is whether we want this data to be accessible by going directly to the database from Rails, or whether we prefer this to go through the API. But now, since like it's a separate logical database, the container registry, which is separate app, can fully manage that. From like administrator perspective, it's fully transparent, because it's like logical database within the same Postgres that they are running. It's replicated automatically with the current mechanism. Nothing really changes. What it offers, it gives us flexibility that if we notice container registry consumes a lot of selects on the database, it's very slow. Administrator can shard this database, or may decide, I'm just gonna move the data into another instance, but it would be not default. Default would be, we start on the same, we replicate everything. It would just create a separation between different data.
And the same applies for the prefect database. It's not like where we keep our repos. It's like a lower level, so not user-facing database in the same way.
Sure. Like maybe, so at GitLab, we have, I'm going to call it two turbos. We got two things that really drive our business. we have the wider community contributions which come out of open source, and we have the advantages of a single application. And that leads to, like, if you use an additional stage, you're 3 times more likely to convert, or namespace is 3 more times likely to convert. This is like the essence of our business. Like, we are only successful because we have a complete DevOps platform delivered as a single application. That is essential to more licensed users, higher revenue per users, which leads to more IACV. This is core to GitLab. What I'm afraid of is, okay, well, the container registry, no, it's a separate thing. Okay, now I want to see, I have an attack on the company. So there was a account compromised. I suddenly want to see, of all the people who has been last spotted in the Netherlands, where I'm from, who accessed containers. Now I've got to do a join between a user table and a last access table and the container registry. And I can't do it because they're in separate databases. This is a contrived example. I'm sure that there's simpler examples. But suddenly we can't do it because you can no longer do a join. Or like, hey, one of the main benefits of GitLab is that it's easy for me as a user to switch from source code to CI. If I now, instead of querying a database, need to access another app, the latency is going to increase. I don't know whether it's 2x, 10x, or 100x, but it might, on many cases, be slower. So now it doesn't quite work as well anymore. It's more like GitHub with Travis CI instead of the GitLab experience. And then we're losing something that is like core to our business.
But if you take a look at the example, I sorry, I keep going back to it, but the example of Redis, hey, I'm even wearing the t-shirt. With that example, right, what we were able to do is we can tune these different machines that have got different workloads and get better performance rather than like slowing down by breaking up the data across multiple instances. So we could say, well, the cache instance has got a certain type of workload, and over time we've tuned for that. And like, if anything, I think the performance improves because you can sort of match the machines to the workload that they're running. And sort of for the first example, like I do some of that investigation, and I most of the time I kind of base that sort of thing on logs rather than like an online transaction processing database. So I know you said it was a contrived example, but I don't think that would slow you down that much in that kind of security investigation.
Security investigation, or just small numbers, or things like that. So I think sort of Redis was a big success. I want to acknowledge that. It's different. Like for Redis, there's no config. For Redis, like self-hosted had them in the actual same namespace. We're proposing that the proposal for the manifest is to put it in a different namespace. That is different. For Redis, you don't do joins. It's more of a key value store. So there's no relational joins that you can do or cannot do based on putting it in a different database.
Mm-hmm. With regards to the joins, the other point that I wanted to make was that, there's certain types there's certain times where just any developer from any part of the application taking a join from their object across to another part of the application can kind of speed up your development. But with something like the container registry, where it's so isolated, right? If you have to kind of refactor half of the application every time you're trying to iterate on that, ultimately you slow things down. And so at some level of complexity, having those bulkheads between different parts of your application can help speed things up to some degree. And, it obviously depends on the case, and there's a lot of different cases, but like if we did service extraction right, I think that would be an advantage, not a disadvantage, and help speed things up because
if we do anything right, if I'm a NBA basketball player that scores well, I could get a great contract. Yes. However, getting it right is what my inquiry is about. And what I think is happening a little bit is that this team is responsible for running all our data stores. So logically, you're focused on that. And I acknowledge that these things are easier and more reliable to run if you separate them more. However, there's also the advantages of a single application that we don't have to lose in the process. And I have a super hard time seeing kind of the list of containers living in GitLab HQ and then the manifest living somewhere else and how that interacts. Like things like that, they worry me. And
So
go ahead.
yes, so I think in the end, we're gonna have to shard, like make raise up, gonna have to be sharded. Unlikely that any of the actuary database is gonna have to be sharded in the long time. A lot of problems from the sharding is like you need to figure out like the best possible partition. People using cross joins across different tables make this partition and sharding less efficient. Now, if you kind of add to that a little more effort, just use a well-structured API, it makes this sharding more efficient because the API, by creating this abstraction, makes it easier for you to cache. Container registry example is something that it works today like that. It's inefficient, not because we are using API. It's inefficient that we are accessing object storage, which is like very slow. Now, when we start accessing database, we can access all information about the given project in a single request and push to you. Similarly, how we do that with that application, it's gonna make the significant performance improvement by not sacrificing performance, but actually making you more aware about creating proper split between different responsibilities. So in case of the sharding, it actually kind of the split, it makes it easier to shard database because these cross joins are anti-sharding.
I would summarize your cases. We have to shard at some point. When we shard, we can't do we can't do the big joins anyway, so we need to go to an API approach. I very much disagree with that. If we shard by root namespace, people only care about people in their organization. Like we have customers, and customers care about, we have users, they belong to an organization. They care about that organization. They care about the containers in that organization. They care about productivity in that organization. We have very few things that cut across organizations. And those things, I agree, we should treat like APIs, our explore page, things like that. But like 99.9% of the actual usage of GitLab is within a group, basically. So I think we have a great sharding mechanism. I think, and I don't agree that sharding would lead us to a whole bunch of API things that used to be database joins now being API calls. I think making all that API calls would lead to a disastrously slow user experience. So I think we've got a great opportunity to shard because GitLab is mainly used like within the context of an organization.
We have 1 minute.
It's actually also maybe another interesting tangential point. It's like about coupling within application. Like our application is very deeply coupled between different contexts.
I don't want to, and I think that sharding is our future. We got to nail that. And we learned with Geo that it was super important to make prototypes. And I've seen that there's been a sharding working group for months now, but I've not seen any lines of code. And I think as soon as we get down to that level, it will be much easier to have these conversations because we'll have real examples. And it's always like discussing programming patterns. Everyone disagrees in the abstract because everyone has their favorite. I think this conversation makes clear, it's clear what the database team wants and it's clear what I want. But we need to get down to examples to do this. And we know that sharding is our future. I'd put all our chips on sharding because if we're able to shard, I think we'll get to 100x. I've seen the comments about 20% of our data can be sharded. I'd love to dive into that, look at what that actually is, because I think sharding is going to be amazing for us. And I think we should bet on that. I think the detour of spinning out services, we can discuss that, but we need to have, as said before in this conversation, if we do that, we need to do it right and think through all of the implications for the user experience, because that's one of our two turbos and we can't afford, it's not acceptable to lose one of our turbos.
So on the topic of the sharding working group, most of the time has been spent investigating Citus, because it showed a lot of promise early on, right? And then we ran into the licensing roadblock, both on the enterprise and the community side. So we're done with our Citus evaluation, and now we'll switch over to what's built into PG11 and foreign data wrappers and what the various permutations are there.
That sounds really exciting. I intuitively, like, I have a hard time picking between database sharding and application sharding, but database sharding for sure is ideal for like the speed of iteration at GitLab. So if we can make that work, that would be amazing. It's going to be tougher, but I'd love to explore that. And I think we should totally focus on that and put all our chips in that as the way to get there. Thanks everyone for the conversation. Strong opinions, loosely held, and I do recognize that this is a super tough technical problem. So I don't have the answers, but I do have some concerns that need to be addressed.
And on the database team, we have some ideas on what to do next. Some of it's mitigation about the current database size and some things that we can do. And then we'll get some more detail on what we can do going forward with partitioning and sharding iteration with what's built into Postgres 11. And I will summarize those in the brainstorming doc and then make sure it's somewhere in an epic or an issue as well. Cool. So I'll follow up with a summary.
Thanks, much appreciated. Thanks everyone.